Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Fire Breathing Rob here on YouTube with our video podcast, and we are also on our 10 radio stations all over the country. So I want to thank all of our sponsors for that. And also, if you're watching us on this video podcast for YouTube, please like, subscribe, and also comment and share these videos. We interview amazing people that have done amazing things all over the country and also all over the world. So thank you for listening. I have somebody on here, and we're going to talk about, obviously, with all the craziness going on, a little bit of a lightheaded topic here. This is Hal Marcovitz, and he is a journalist and also a writer. And he wrote a book, which I think we should all read if you're into politics, such as me, which is called Painting the White House. So, Hal, thanks so much for coming on the program. We greatly appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
All right, so Hal, let's start off this interview by just telling the viewers a little bit about you and what got you into writing in general.
Well, I was a newspaper journalist for more than 30 years, starting back in the 1970s. And I worked for 3 daily newspapers over that time and covered a lot of politics. And so I kind of have an insight into the way politicians think, believe it or not. And for the last 10 or 15 years or so, I've been writing books.
So what is your favorite part of writing?
I guess that to have written a sentence, a paragraph, a story, whatever, and just to have it come out exactly the way you wanted it to come out, that it's bright, it sparkles, it's prose that grabs you, as we say, grab the reader. When I was in newspapers, it's just the absolute art of the craft of writing and just doing it the right way.
Right. So I want to extend on that as far as writing. In the book we're talking about is Painting the White House by Hal Marcovitz, and he's on the program here on Fire Breathing Rod. Hal, as far as writing this book, what made you want to write this book? Was it your interest in politics throughout the years, or was it just your interest in presidents?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I wanted to start writing fiction, as all newspaper reporters eventually want to do. I wanted to start writing fiction. So I had written some short stories and that sort of thing. And one day, a few years ago, I was painting the interior of my house. I was putting some wall paint on, and it occurred to me that it would be a kind of a funny story to talk about a house painter painting the White House. And that's kind of how it occurred to me while I was painting my own house. And that's what the book is about. It's about an ordinary house painter who gets hired by the First Lady to paint the White House. And once he gets involved, gets inside, shows up with his brushes and his paints and his ladders and rollers, whatever. He gets inside and he starts work, but he finds himself involved with all the intrigues and goofy goings on that happen in the White House. So that's kind of the genesis of the book and how I kind of got the idea for it.
But how long did it take you to write this book? And in general, is that a long process to research and write these books?
Well, writing for fiction and writing for nonfiction are two different animals. If you're writing a scholarly work, as I think your professor was doing, and it's going to be, highly vetted, and the sources have to be extreme, top notch. Yes, it's going to take a very, very long time. And that's the type of writing that is. It's scholarly work, and it takes, a long time to track down the sources, to read them, and it could very well take years. If, right, on the other hand, you're writing a novel, you pretty much just want to sound like you know what you're talking about when you're writing it. And that's what I did. I started reading up on the White House, reading books, reading on the internet what I could, newspaper articles, magazine articles, not so much on who was president and what kind of president they were, but what exactly was the White House all about, how it was built, how many rooms it has, that sort of thing. And that took considerably less time, I'm sure, than a scholarly work of nonfiction. So to answer your question, from start to finish, it took about a year. And that was including the research, the reading that I had to do, and the actual writing.
So going into crazy things that have happened in the White House, and this goes to stuff that you've researched and wrote about and know about. Let's talk about some of these questions that we brought up. And we'll start off with this one. Who was Betsy Donahue, and what was the role that she played in the construction of the White House?
The White House was designed by an architect named James Hoban. And this is, of course, back in the 1790s or whatever. And he won a competition, and he got the contract to design the White House. And kind of an interesting aside to that story is one of the competitors that he beat out for the contract was Thomas Jefferson, who submitted his own plan for the White House. But Hoban won the contract, and he designed the White House. And he also supervised the construction of the White House out there on Pennsylvania Avenue. So he decided he was going to keep an eye on the construction 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So he had himself a cabin built on the grounds of the White House at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And he moved in and he lived there, and he watched the construction, and he supervised that construction day in, day out. So the project's going along, and eventually it gets to the point where Hoban decides he doesn't really have to live there anymore. The things are going well. He can move back home and just show up in the morning and keep an eye on the place. So he moves out of the cabin, but he rents it to a carpenter named Donahue and his wife, Betsy. So the Donahues move into the cabin, and within a very short period of time, it was learned by the authorities that Betsy Donahue was running a brothel out of the cabin. So the first official use of the White House was as a brothel, and the Donahues were found out, and they were kicked out.
Which is what president discovered that somebody stole his underwear?
That was President James Madison, and it happened during the War of 1812. And what happened was, as we know, the British invaded, and they marched into Washington, into the capital, and the city was evacuated, and the president and his family were evacuated from the White House. So the British show up, and they break into the White House, and they're walking around, and a couple of they were British sailors, about 150 of them. And a couple of the sailors find their way into the president's bedroom, and sure enough, they find his underwear. And they took it with them, and then, as we know, they burned down the White House. So I imagine, like I said, they were sailors, and probably on those sea voyages, took a few months to get across the Atlantic Ocean. You probably really appreciated clean underwear. So those British guys, had some clean underwear for the voyage home.
Well, they got to make sure what size was the underwear. That's the question. Because if you only had underwear that's too big, it's not going to fit too good.
History did not record the fact that whether that underwear fit those guys when on the voyage home.
Oh gosh, this is insane stuff. But this is great comedy. What was unusual about President Hoover and First Lady Hoover treating the White House domestic staff? What did they do to them that was so unusual?
This was Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry Hoover, the First Lady, did not want to see members of the White House domestic staff as they walked around the hallways in the White House. We're talking about the the housekeepers, the cooks, the butlers, whoever the domestic staff was. The Hoovers just didn't want to see them around the house. So they issued tiny bells to all the employees. And the employees, the domestic workers, were under orders that if they saw the Hoovers in the hallway or wherever in the White House, they were to ring these little bells. And that was a signal to everybody on the floor to hide. So when they heard these bells ring, they would jump around the corner, they'd go in the closets, they would, hide behind doors, whatever. Now, there's a funny postscript to this story, and it seems that by the 1990s, when Bill and Hillary Clinton moved in, Hillary Clinton is walking down the hallway in the White House one day, and she sees a couple of the domestic workers kind of dart across the hallway and run into a closet. So she follows them, and she opens the closet door, and she asks them what they're doing. And they tell her that they're under orders to hide when they see a member of the president's family. And Hillary told them, well, you don't have to do that. But it kind of begs the question, was this going on for 50 years from the time the Hoovers left to the time the Clintons got in? I guess it was.
That's crazy. But was that because of Hoover? Was that like an ego thing that they did that, or?
I don't know. I never found out what was about that they didn't like. But I guess they, one would assume that they considered the White House their home, and they kind of didn't want to see anybody else in their house.
Elvis Presley, big music star, and I believe he was also in some movies too in general. I could be corrected on that. What gift did he give to Richard Nixon while he was in the White House?
Well, first of all, Elvis was in a lot of movies, so just so you have that straight.
Well, Hal, it was before my time. I'm just a young chicken.
Just go see Viva Las Vegas, and that will stun you. That's just an absolute terrific movie, and I remember when I saw it when I was a kid, and just a terrific film. But anyway, when I came across this story, I just laughed and laughed and laughed. This is one of my favorite stories. Elvis, of course, lived in Memphis and Graceland, and he was something of a police buff. And by that, I mean he collected badges and belt buckles and, little stuff like that the police departments use. And he had his eye on a Drug Enforcement Administration badge, okay, the badge that's issued to the DEA agents. And he wanted a DEA badge. And he asked around, and he found out the only way he could get a DEA badge is to become a DEA agent. Well, of course, Elvis is not going to, give up being the king of rock and roll to enroll in DEA agent school.
Right.
So he decides all on his own that he will get himself deputized as a DEA agent by President Nixon. So he calls together his group of guys, and he says, we're going to go up to Washington today, and I'm going to get sworn in as a DEA agent. So they pile into a limousine, and they head out to the airport, and they fly right up to Washington, and they get into another limo, and they drive right up to the gate of the White House.
So this was unannounced?
This was unannounced.
Wow.
Totally on the spur of the moment. Elvis gets out of the limousine, goes right up to the gate, and tells the guard what he's there for. So the guard calls into the White House and tells them Elvis is at the gate, and he wants to be deputized by the president as a DEA agent. Well, this story circles around the White House like crazy, and they're having meetings, and then what do we do about this? Elvis Presley is at the door. Should we do this? And they decide, yes, let's do this. This would be great publicity, and we'll make this happen. So they find some time at the end of like the lunch hour when Nixon, typically met dignitaries who happened to be in town that day, that sort of thing. So they find a few minutes for this to happen. So the time comes, and Elvis and his guys go into the White House, and he meets with Nixon in the Oval Office, and there's a picture taken of the meeting, and Elvis is wearing one of those velour jumpsuits, with the cape. And it's my understanding that photograph is the #1 selling souvenir at the Nixon Library in California.
Wow.
So Nixon deputizes Elvis as a DEA agent and gives him the badge. And Elvis has brought a gift along for President Nixon. And he gives him the gift there in the Oval Office, and it happens to be a gun. So Elvis managed to bring a gun into the White House. And if Can you imagine that happening today? Oh my God, the
Never.
Secret Service would tackle him and throw him in prison and we'd never hear from him again. But apparently they looked it over and decided it was unloaded and it was fine. Elvis gives Nixon the gun and he leaves with his badge. And the funny postscript to this story is evidently, not evidently, but when Elvis left, Nixon turns to his aides and he says he really doesn't know who that guy was. He knows he's some kind of a singer and his daughters listen to his music, but who is that? The king of what? Rock and roll? What? I don't know who that is.
This is Hal Marcovitz. He wrote a book called Painting the White House.
Can
And
I show?
we're
Here it is.
say again?
That's the book right there.
Oh, okay. Got the book. Right. So Painting the White House, and Hal's showing you the book right now. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. This is interesting that I found this out, and I want you to talk about this with the few questions that we have left. You said that there's a branch of the government that is in charge of hunting mice.
Well, the question is, which branch of government is in charge of exterminating the mice from the White House? And this fact goes back to the Carter administration. And Jimmy Carter is working in the Oval Office one day, and he notices this rather unpleasant odor. And he has deduced that a mouse has died in the wall of the Oval Office. So he calls the General Services Administration and tells them to come into the White House and get the mouse out of the wall. And the GSA tells him, sorry, Mr. President, we're only responsible for the maintenance inside the walls of the White House. So Carter calls the National Park Service and tells them to get the mouse out of the wall. And the National Park Service responds, sorry, Mr. President, we're only responsible for the maintenance of the White House outside the walls. So first, the first observation here is, yes, somehow that mouse was removed. I don't know how, but the answer to the question is evidently no branch of government is responsible for getting mice out of the White House.
That Donald Trump, when he moved into the White House, he said that this place is a crap hole. Well, it was another word, but we won't use it.
No, he said we can use it. He was out with his golf buddies and he called it a, quote, real dump. So that's the words he used. He said it was a real dump. And there has been some work on the White House since he moved in. Right. I believe it was already appropriated before he moved in, but they spent $3 million on fixing up the heating and air conditioning system. So that's been taken care of. Trump didn't like the chandelier in the president's dining room. So he had that changed, and I believe he paid for it himself.
Oh, wow.
And he also had one of those 60-inch flat screen TVs hung on the wall in the dining room, so he would have something to watch, I guess Fox News, while he ate his hamburgers.
What's unusual with the sleeping quarters with Trump and his wife Melania in the White House? The president's family actually lives on the second floor of the White House. It's an apartment up there above, all the ceremonial rooms and the offices and everything. There's on the second floor, it's an apartment, and that's where the president and his family actually live. And over the years, it's not been unusual for presidents and first ladies not to share a bedroom. And plenty of presidents and plenty of first ladies have had their separate rooms. And I can see why. The president's up all night and he's talking to heads of state and across the world and who knows where. And I guess he's spent some time on Twitter, so he's probably up pretty late. And the first lady probably just wants to get to bed. What happened is there's also a third floor above that apartment, and there's some rooms up there. And during the Obama administration, Michelle Obama's mother lived up there, president's mother-in-law. So after the Obamas moved out and the Trumps moved in, Melania discovers this third floor, and that's where she moved in. So the Trumps not only do not share a bedroom, they don't even share the same floor in the White House. firstly, what advice would you give young people that are into writing? They are into media and politics. They like to write, and they want to write as far as in a newspaper or an online blogs or even books, you know, down the road in their life. What advice would you give them?
Well, I would say, start with the basics. Uh, I read a lot, and a lot of what I read is poorly written. So start with the basics: grammar, punctuation, spelling. Do everything you can to learn as much as you can about the tools you're going to need to tell your story. And once you learn all that, it gets easier. And the second lesson, we used to say when I was in daily journalism, don't bury the lead. And I don't know if you know what that means, but it means you didn't put the most important part of the story at the top. You buried it. It's down in the middle somewhere. So it really takes a good eye and some experience and some practice to look at a story and recognize the part of the story that the readers are going to want to know first. So I think those are two pretty good pieces of advice for anybody just starting out. Well, you can find out about the book and me and some other interesting stuff at paintingthewhitehouse.com. And you can order the book through that website, and you can read a little bit about me. There's an excerpt from the book, and a lot of stories about the truly weird things that go on in the White House. And again, it is a novel. It's a made-up story, but in researching the book, I found all these really, really funny facts. So I've included those on the website. So it's, I hope everybody takes a look and gets their laugh for today.
Hal Marcovitz, Painting the White House. Definitely check out that book and also buy it. I think it will be very valuable for people my age to read and people of all ages in general. So Hal, thanks so much for coming on the program. We greatly appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for your time, Rob. It was a pleasure.